6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
How about we do it again?
6, 7, 4, 3, 2, 1. They got bored.
Okay, let's try one more
I
time.
definitely.
Ready?
I can move you. Making review. Making review.
Say 6,
6,
5.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, Rank and Reviewers. You have found your way to episode 82 of Rank and Review, and it is called Games of Fate. Regular guest Paxton Francis returns to discuss 6 interesting films in which fate intervenes, or in which our very natures, whether we have free will or whether we are all predetermined, is wrestled with. As usual, you will find coarse language, and as usual, you will find spoilers for all 6 movies being discussed. My name's Larry Parsons. I'm your host in Random Canadian, and I really appreciate you listening to my podcast. You'd be doing me a favor if you spread the word. You could find the podcast on Facebook. You can find it on iTunes. It's on Stitcher. And if you'd like to send feedback, you can do that by writing me at ranknreview@gmail.com. That's ranknreview@gmail.com. Well, that's enough for the time being. Let's all nestle in for some Games of Fate. I would like to welcome Paxton Francis back to the podcast, and we're doing Games of Fate. And you were a philosophy major, so what I'm looking for here on your third, I guess, sort of third appearance. I mean, you were in the Star Wars episode, but you didn't have the whole episode.
That's true.
But
I
so your
talked
third,
almost
like,
enough for
full
the
episode anyway. All I'm going to ask of you is the answers to life, the universe, and everything. And I did read Hitchhiker's Guide, so I know that the mice fucked up the math, but do we truly have free will? Is everything before us predisposed? No matter what choice we think we make spontaneously, is it just a chemical reaction in the brain that would have happened regardless of anything? Like, is this just a fucking sham that we're existing through?
Well, I wish I could promise everybody an answer to that.
That's not too much to ask.
I don't think there's one forthcoming, but maybe I shouldn't say that right up front here. You can cut that, right? There will be an answer to that question of whether we have free will. We cracked the code while working on this podcast. People have been trying to figure that one out for a very long time.
I think that this is a closer to almost like Twilight Zone episodes for the most part of this, as they're like Games of Fate is what we're calling the episodes, but I think that theme is relevant through most of these stories. Like, what are you in control of? What can you take control of in certain circumstances? If you were given the chance to change or pick a different path, would you, and why? Lawrence Kasdan did a movie called Grand Canyon where Steve Martin's character memorably says all of life's riddles are answered in the movies. So these 6 movies are going to help us answer whether or not we truly have, free will, or whether or not the cosmos is laid out before us.
Answer guaranteed.
That's
a
all
Larry
that's what we
Parsons
need to get
promise.
To. We'll get to. We'll sit through it. Maybe we'll come back to it at the end of the podcast.
Is existence predestined?
Yeah.
Larry has the answer.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping to.
I hope we find it too.
I was going to ask if you remember why you chose this list, if there was a particular title that jumped out, or if there was...
Yeah, there is. And that was mainly that I wanted to talk about Groundhog Day.
Nice.
When I looked at that list of movies. But part of it was that there was a movie on there when I was looking through the list of movies, you had just days or weeks before mentioned Knowing in a conversation, and spotted that on the list, saw Cube, which is an interesting film and there's a lot to say about, and thought maybe that's the next one for me. I wanted to do something that was a little bit closer to the horror genre, or at least a genre film closer to what this podcast is rooted in.
I think
because everything I've done so far has been a special episode, a war episode, a Star Wars episode, a sci-fi episode. None of them have been straight on.
Yeah, sort of.
You know, we've got Groundhog Day, but they're at least rooted in a theme a little bit closer to what this podcast.
There's a fantastical element to all
That's
of
right.
this. There
That's
absolutely
right.
is.
They're more supernatural.
And I would argue, even though Groundhog Day is, you know, a romantic comedy unabashedly, that there is like a sinister side to that story. There is something strangely terrifying of being forced to relive the same day over and over again. Anyway, sorry, like Baxter was saying, the 6 movies that we are going to discuss. Cult Canadian item, Cube.
97?
Yeah, 97 was when it was made, and it sort of was a slow burn. Kind of had a rollout around the world, and the nerddom is a little divided on it, and I understand the division, but we're going to talk about Cube.
It'll be fun to talk about.
The already discussed Groundhog Day, starring The Bill.
The Bill.
From Alex Proyas, controversial director. He just did this movie, Gods of Egypt, that got so critically lambasted that he went like on the record saying that people like you and I that talk about movies critically are these fucking scumbags that don't deserve to live on earth. So feel free to take the gloves off if you want to on Knowing.
I don't know if I'll do that. Not the last time. I think it was maybe my first time on your podcast. Was that the first one?
The sci-fi.
We did with the sci-fi?
Yeah.
When we really were not very nice to
iRobot.
iRobot by Alex Proyas.
But I remind you, he did do Dark City.
Yeah.
And that's a good movie.
I would hesitate to call this show critical all that often. It's rare that I don't hear mostly love coming from...
I try to be balanced, but every now and then a Godzilla or a Dreamcatcher will come along and I will lose my composure a
or the
little bit.
prequels. I kind of got carried away there with the Phantom Menace.
A recent Tom Cruise science fiction action picture called, depending on when you saw it, either The Edge of Tomorrow or Live, Die, Repeat. So there's that.
One of those is a better title, and I don't even need to tell your listeners which that is.
A fantastical thriller called The Cooler, and Canadian-made beginning of the big franchise, The Final Destination, where death comes calling. Is there anything else you'd like to say by way of introduction before we jump into this episode of Rank and Review?
No, if I think of anything, I'll just beat myself up later.
Let's do it.
Let's get going.
A cube.
26 rooms high, 26 rooms across.
17,576 rooms.
Does anybody remember how they got here?
Why would they throw innocent people in here? Are we being punished?
There's a way in here, so there's gotta be a way out.
Do you think they'd go to all the trouble to build this thing if we could just walk out?
Take a good long look around. But I got a feeling it's looking at us.
We have about 3 days without food and water before we're too weak to move.
I just want to wake up.
I looked into a room down there and something almost cut my head off.
Motion detectors integrated into the walls. Tough to spot.
You're not getting out of here.
Yes, we are! There is no way out of here!
We need to get around the trap.
So the podcast is an opportunity to learn about each other. Surprise to note, I've always had an interest in genre cinema. And I do have a lot of respect for Canadian filmmakers, and especially in recent years, I've had more than a passing interest in Canadian independent genre cinema. And one of the true rags to riches heroic stories that Canada has to offer for that doesn't have the name Cronenberg attached to it anyway, is Cube. Vincenzo Natali is a Canadian filmmaker, and I'm sure that I don't know this, but I have to believe at some point someone's tried to lure him to the excited States. But he has doggedly stayed in Canada and made his movies. I don't love all of them, and they, much like Cube, usually have really cool parts to them and really strange parts to them, and the give and take of independent Canadian cinema.
I haven't seen any of his other movies, but we did take a peek.
Yeah. Splice is a particularly interesting one with Sarah Polley and Adrian Brody inventing a new life form by combining human DNA and their gooey science.
Well, there's certainly a lot in Cube that, there's enough there for me to say I would be surprised if nobody tried to lure him to the States.
Yeah. So I have respect for the director, and I realize, I bring my own baggage to this. I might be at risk of overhyping Cube to somebody, because I don't want to necessarily oversell the movie, but I would want to encourage anybody who's listening to this podcast who likes genre movies and who hasn't seen Cube to give it its day in court, because I think it earns at least that.
You're not going to have pushback from me on that. Cube is an eminently watchable movie.
Yeah.
And there's a lot there to appreciate, even if just on the level of like, wow, this movie got made.
Yeah. And it is a high concept science fiction piece. A bunch of strangers wake up in a cube room full of look like bank vault doors, and they
strange color coded rooms, each a copy of the next.
So
laden with traps.
Basically,
traps.
From a set perspective, they had two of these rooms that they could move from one place to another, but they basically were redressing the same sets over and over and over again. And the machine or whatever, this alien box that they're in, is moving. They're clearly on a clock. It's a puzzle that they need to solve. These strangers thrown together a la Night of the Living Dead, as you correctly pointed out when we were talking about it earlier, have to work together to survive this crisis. And in typical psychological, Twilight Zone ways, they more fail at doing that than succeed.
In a pretty big way, for the most part.
Yeah, so that's where we started in Cube.
Yes. Cube is a movie that I saw with you 2 decades ago when it was new on video.
Yep.
We have a long history with Cube.
On glorious VHS.
On glorious VHS. I had not seen Cube probably since the late 90s. I watched it several times at that point when it was fairly new, and I don't think I'd touched it, even though I'm pretty sure I have a copy on VHS somewhere. Truth be told, I got my hands on a digital copy in high def, so this is my first time seeing it in close to film quality, and that was kind of cool. I'm not sure if it added to the movie or took away from it, because it did make some of the effects less believable, and some of the digital effects in the movie didn't even look great at the time. The swords that shoot out of the walls at one point are sort of like on par with some of the effects in the Lynch Dune. Yeah. Right? Which is
and that movie
years
is
older.
Yeah, much
almost
older.
15 years older than Cube.
But again, they're working with a limited budget, and you'll find limited. I'm quite forgiving of stuff like this. I will definitely forgive a wonky special effect if I'm engaged by the characters in the story, and for the most part I am. For me, it's not the concept, it's not even the story, even though there are archetypical characters, definitely.
By design, there are very specific characters there for a reason.
Yeah, but they're almost set up built-in obstacles for them to get around, but the acting is wonky. Yes. I can't sugarcoat it.
You said you can forgive a lot of things in an independent movie, and in such a cheaply made sort of like heroic movie-making sense. But there are problems in Cube that are unforgivable, and one of them is the performance that we get out of our lead actor.
Do we have his name?
We do have his name. His name is Quentin is Maurice Dean Wint.
Yeah, I remember when we first saw it, we always joked, this is, anybody not from Canada can check out for the next 40 seconds or so. But I always joked that he was like Hal Johnson from Body Break, like this
Body Break. Yep.
So instead of teaching us about how to stay healthy and do exercises in the office,
he was trapped in a cube.
He's trapped in a cube and completely falls apart.
See, now the same actor plays basically the same archetype in an episode of Twitch City when cats have taken over the world. And he's perfect for that role because he's a cartoon.
Yeah, he's way over the top.
Ridiculous cartoon. And we see him go from protective cop to there's a certain Night of the Living Dead ring to him too. To like he tries to rape Summer.
All of a sudden that seems to come out of
there's
nowhere.
This domestic abuse thing that happens and he takes his thing off. He's literally wearing a wife beater and hitting her and throwing her around. I don't know, his character, there are problems with his character even on a script level.
Yeah.
But they are amplified to the nth degree by the fact that the guy is out of control.
Yeah.
Somebody needed to reel that performance in.
It was supposed to be a big reveal that this guy turns out to be an obstacle and not the heroic figure. And to its credit, when it came out, we hadn't seen this a lot, this bait and switch thing, or at least not as much.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly wasn't breaking new ground, but it wasn't something that we would have necessarily anticipated if an actual actor had taken the role. I'm sorry to be so mean about it.
Well, imagine the movie even if they just replaced him with, say, Tony Todd.
Yeah.
Even Tony Todd.
He would have killed it.
And I think this movie would have been fine.
Yeah.
It is fine. Like, I don't want to be too negative about Cube. Like so many of the times I've been on this podcast, there's not a movie of the 6 that I would say is awful.
Yeah,
So,
no, and it is worth
I'll
watching.
preface anything negative I say about Cube with that.
The other sort of story archetype, and I talked about it recently on my Stephen King episode, is this autistic savant character, which is not to say that...
Kazan? Was that his name?
Yeah, that's according to Wikipedia.
Kazan?
But I totally realize that there are autistic people who are amazingly gifted at math and numbers. It's not that it's not a credible plot device necessarily. It's to me just that it's a tired one. Again, maybe less so in 97, but certainly, yeah.
Well, savant abilities in somebody as profound as being able to figure out how many factors these huge numbers have in an instant, right? Problems that supercomputers crunch on for ages.
Yeah.
That kind of, if that kind of Rain Man to the 10th power stuff is real, it's very rare. And while it's true that somebody as profoundly autistic as that character would very likely have hyper-focused interests, and there would be certain things that he was really good at compared to his other abilities, I found it entirely not easy to believe, entirely unbelievable that he would be able to do that kind of math. Now, maybe I'm, even after working with autistic people for years, a number of years anyway, maybe I'm naive about that. Maybe it's more common than I'm aware of. But it struck me as like, part of it is 20 years later, we've seen that trick a number of times.
I think that the actor does as well as he can, but he's been served a really difficult meal. And again, it just personally tends to rub me the wrong way. And the first time I watched Cube, I would not have mentioned it probably at all, but here I am.
While we're on the subject of his character, I found it interesting how inhumanely almost everybody treats him, particularly our main character, and how quickly, watching that movie, you're turned off from the cop character Quentin so quickly because as soon as the kid shows up, Quentin's awful to him.
Yeah,
I think he even drops an R-bomb on him and calls him a retard.
Yeah,
very early after he shows up in the movie, and the difference in just societal norms as far as what's said and felt about people with special needs have changed so much between 97 and now.
Yeah.
I wonder if that affects how the character plays too. I remember having the same reaction to the character in 97 as I did now, but I noticed it this time. I don't remember coming out of Cube the first time thinking like, wow, he was really awful to that autistic guy. I remember thinking that guy was a huge ass to everyone, and he was.
Yeah.
But he was particularly
and that's
awful
when things started to
Kazan.
tip over. He was willing to help these other people because they all had roles to play. They could help, but this guy was just an obstacle. If you touched him, he would scream, and he wasn't amenable to listen to people when they gave him instructions. So he was more an impediment than anything else.
And that's my other problem with him having the super math genius whiz kid abilities.
Yeah.
Is that it validates that line of thinking, that if he wasn't a whiz kid, then he would just be baggage. He'd be dead weight. And in a real crisis situation, maybe some people are a burden, but it just seems to me that it might have been more interesting if Kazan's contribution could have been something a little bit less than the mathematical key to solving the entire puzzle. Right? Now, I know that the show is a spoiler-friendly zone, right? Because everybody knows that. But it should be explained that it's... I wanted to mention that it's very late in the movie that the characters come into having a very important piece of information, which is they're inside a giant three-dimensional moving Rubik's Cube sort of construction, where every few minutes the rooms all shuffle themselves around like a big puzzle.
Yeah.
And that is one of the most interesting elements of the movie to me, but it's also tied into the main place where the script of the movie creaks for me is, and conceptually they had to make this decision, I suppose, very early on to just not even try and address why the cube is built.
No. What answer would we accept? And
the only big problem in the script, really, other than some creaky dialogue here and there, is that question is more interesting to me than anything that happens in the movie.
Are they going to get out?
If you're going to
Who's
leave
gonna
a
live?
question out, sometimes you have to leave that kind of thing out of a movie, fine.
Yeah.
But if that thing you're leaving out is more compelling fodder for a story, who the hell built this cube and why?
Yeah.
Is it Quentin's ridiculous idea that some millionaire is entertaining himself? And I love Helen's reaction.
Just thinks
to
that's
it,
hilarious.
too. And the only reason she's the only name I haven't had to check Wikipedia for so far, and it's because is it Worth who laughs when he finds out her name is Helen and says, "You're such a Helen"?
Right.
And it's so true. That actress is her name actually Helen? She is such a Helen. It is Helen, right? I hope so. Yeah, Dr. Helen Holloway, played by Nikki. Well, she's more of a Helen than a Nikki, I think. She's one of the strong points in the movie, performance-wise, I think.
It's true. We haven't mentioned, too, that as they move room to room, those rooms are lethally trapped. The movie opens with a man desperately crawling into this room, an alarm buzzing, and these wires zipping through him, and he is literally cubed. Now,
I did mention it, but you rarely listen to me when I'm on the podcast.
The traps?
Yeah,
I just can't remember if we hit the
it's all
traps.
good.
But,
That's slice and dice thing that happens in the opening of the movie. Is
I wanted to
great.
mention that because the first Resident Evil movie outright steals
They
that
just
death.
lift it,
Like,
okay.
completely. It's laser beams instead of, like, wires.
Deadly laser.
But even the fact that, like, he stands there motionlessly after they pass through him for a second, and then you just see the lines starting to form and bleed, and the way he falls apart, it's almost shot for shot. So, shame on you, Resident Evil.
And like 2 days before I rewatched Cube in preparation for this podcast, I saw an episode of Rick and Morty where Rick's spaceship dices an alien into
Yeah.
pieces, just like Cube. The lines show. That was one of the spots where the high def did not do
It hurt
really
it,
any
yeah.
favors. You can see when the blood grid shows up on his shirt, you can see that there's no mark in the shirt. It's just
Yeah.
a blood effect. And then when he actually falls apart into the cubes, you see what the movie did there? It's called Cube. And he's cut into cubes. It's so obviously little pieces, like little cubes of latex, and they're well made. I appreciate it. I look at it and go, oh wow, somebody spent all the time painting the inside of each of those cubes. But you're thinking about the paint.
Yeah.
You're not thinking about the gore
It'll
that you're
distract
supposed to
you.
be. And that problem wasn't present on VHS,
Yeah.
which is the only way I'd ever seen the movie.
Another thing that's more familiar now that was less familiar to me, at least to me when I saw it, was they spent some time in the first 20 minutes on this great French escapist character who's starting to
The
figure
Ren.
shit out, and everybody stick with me, I've got this, I will get you out of here. I've broken out of any prison, right? It's like, thank God our savior is here. And bam, he has a very sudden, very extremely violent death.
Yeah, they kind of
That
deeply
sorta-
see him.
Yeah, and it sets the stage, like the stakes are huge, and life and death is, and this badass, he was one of the first people out the game, right? And I've seen that a lot since Cube, but I don't remember seeing it a lot before.
Well, you know what the movie does really well with that character? Now, first of all, his introduction is one of the more
Hilarious.
ridiculous things Quentin says. Is Quentin's like, this cop is so plugged in that you're the Ren. That whole bit is so stupid and unbelievable. But as a device in the story, I love the Ren, and here's why. Not only does he do that whole Gandalf thing where he shows up and you think, oh, maybe he's going to be safe, and then he's insta-dead, and you realize they're all fucked. But then he refucks them at the end of the movie because they find him again and realize they've been moving in circles. And it's at that point, 9/10 of the way in, that they realize we've been moving around this whole time.
Yeah.
And then
The rooms are
Summer
shifting
character,
as well.
Yeah, exactly. They've been moving and basically walking on a treadmill, right? They would have been better served to just sit
In one
in
room.
the room where they started. In fact, well, we're just dropping spoilers galore. That doesn't need to be
I was
shared.
going to bring it up, but yeah.
While we're on it, I wanted to jump over to Nicole DeBoer,
Right.
The actress who played Summer, who's one of the another
She
one of the
figures
strong
out the prime
performances
number
in the
thing,
movie.
yeah.
She's the math genius, right? Everybody in the box is there.
They have
because
a
they have a
specific
particular
role.
skill or purpose, right? And hers is math. And yeah, I just wanted to mention her because she's a cult famous actress who's famous basically for this movie and for the final season of Deep Space Nine when she played Ezri Dax, the namesake of one of my two cats, actually, who you guys may have heard meow earlier in this podcast.
Hey, if you're in the Star Wars universe, whether she gets another gig, she can probably live off of science fiction fairs and shit like that. So good for her. Canadian actress making well.
Yeah,
So-
but she's really, I think
She's
she's strong
solid.
in the movie,
Yeah.
and she had a difficult job in Deep Space Nine. She was picking up a character who'd been important
Beloved.
and beloved for 6 years and then was killed, and now she's got to be the reincarnation of that character. It's tricky.
Yeah.
But Deep Space Nine was one of maybe my favorite show on TV at the time,
Yeah.
and it was fun because to see this Canadian actress from Cube work her way into
And you
a
said
title
you'd forgotten
role on
that it was
Star
her
Trek.
when you rewatched
When
it.
I rewatched it, I'd forgotten that she was in the movie, and
Yeah.
then there she was. And that character would totally be played by Summer Glau if that movie were made today.
I'm a broken record when I talk about sci-fi, but the landing is always tricky. And so often they stick to the third act. And I think that Cube is definitely a little bit guilty of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just this, and here's the whole fucking movie, so if you haven't seen it, once again, you were warned. Our one survivor is, of course, the autistic savant. And over and above that, we find out that the puzzle would be solved if they all just kept their heads and stayed in the same room. Eventually a door above them would open and they could just climb out. And I found that really disappointing. I really think that it should have been a puzzle that they had to work together to solve. I don't think that they...
It's really disappointing, especially in light of the fact that we don't understand the broader context of why the people who built the box and kidnapped these folks and stuck them in there
Yeah.
did it so cruelly. What were they trying to prove? What were they trying to test? Was it an experiment? Was it some sort of horrible psychological thing? Not only is it... It's terrible that Kazan's the only guy to get out. The movie closes on him wandering out of the box into the sunlight, and sure, he's out, but now what, right?
Yeah.
He dies of exposure in the desert, wherever the hell they built this giant fucking 500-foot box.
Yeah.
Anyway, obviously there's a lot to think about with this movie, right? Because we're...
And
narrowing
I
on.
know I feel like we've spent a lot of time leaning on some of the issues with the movie, but the imagination and what they accomplished with a minimal production budget. I mean, by independent standards, this was a high-budget movie, but they did a lot with a little. And
They did.
I think it earns its cult reputation. And even though, if you haven't seen Cube, we've just spoiled it for you, I once again encourage you to find it.
I do too. I'm glad you stopped us because we were focusing on the problems. The movie is worth watching, and I feel like every frame of it drips with passion. The people making the movie were all very happy to be making this movie, including what's his name who played Quentin, whom we dropped his name earlier. I can't think of it now. Who his main sin was maybe caring too much, a little bit too much passion. He was hugely over the top. Really, if you dial back his performance, almost every other problem in the movie
Would fall in line in a lot of
falls into
ways.
place.
There's still some bad lines in the script, and there's still some wonkiness to it, but high concept, low budget, I'm not wagging my finger.
Yeah, you're the Wren. That whole scene is that's a problem. No matter who's delivering that bit of plot device, it makes no sense. But the movie's really imaginative. It's as pure as science fiction gets in movies, and I have to appreciate it on that level because I'm a sci-fi guy, and so many sci-fi movies are just fantasies set in space.
Yeah.
And this is a hard sci-fi movie. But like so many hard sci-fi movies, it stops short of where the sci-fi book would go, which is who built the cube?
Yeah.
Why are they in it?
But
It's this horrible place that's terrifying, and it works. And I like that part of the movie, the submarine trapped in the cube part of the movie. But there's another part of this movie that remains to be made.
and I haven't seen Cube 2, Hypercube, and I don't know if they get into it in the sequels, which by all accounts were somewhat diminishing.
Oh, there are
returns.
sequels.
There are
I was
sequels.
speaking just euphemistically.
Yeah. There are a couple of sequels. I think 2, but it could be, there might be even 3, I'm not sure. I have not seen them. They're not
Something-
easy to get your hands
something
to,
in
like
my-
most things Canadian made.
Something in my tummy is telling me that I'm better off not
Yeah.
watching Cube 2, 3, and however many more there are.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe that day will come on
Is
Rank and
Cube
Review.
3 called Cube Cubed? Like, is the 3 up in superscript?
If it isn't, it
where
should
the
have been.
exponent would be? Okay.
Good enough.
Groundhog time.
1,000 people freezing their butts off waiting to worship a rat.
Weatherman Phil Connors is spending the day in Puxatawney, Pennsylvania.
Phil? Ned! Ned Ryerson. I did the whistling belly button trick at the high school talent show.
Bing!
Bang!
But Phil's about to find out. He's not just stuck in Puxatawney.
Will you be checking out today, Mr. Connors?
Chance of departure today, 100%.
He's stuck
Groundhog Day!
in Groundhog Day.
I'm reliving the same day over and over.
Phil?
Ned Ryerson?
Bang!
Do you ever have deja vu, Mrs. Lancaster?
I don't think so, but I could check with the kitchen.
Well, it's Groundhog Day. Again?
So I guess a case could be made that there's a couple of titles that are odd ones out in this list, but I think the weirdest sort of wild card is why is Groundhog Day here? Why are we talking about a Bill Murray romantic comedy? Well, first of all, I love the Bill. I realize that he can be a prickly customer in the real world, but on screen, I mean, I rarely have complaints about Bill Murray, and I don't think you'll find an exception here in Groundhog Day. It's a very beloved film, and I think for a good reason. It's also the sort of ground zero for the falling out between Harold Ramis and Bill Murray, which is really sad. I honestly think that there was no Ghostbusters 3, and Bill Murray wasn't interested in participating in any form of Ghostbusters until Harold Ramis died, because of a difference of opinion over Groundhog's Day. And there's strong feelings about this movie, even though it's considered by pretty much everybody I know of as a total classic.
Yeah.
Bill Murray is disappointed because he wanted this fucker to be dark. So I guess my question to start is, what is Groundhog Day doing on this list, and is it truly a romantic comedy, or is there something darker and bigger going on?
It's a romantic comedy, but there's a lot more buried in this movie than rom-com. It's not even buried. It's just right there under the surface. The viewer's not expected to go very deep into the movie before they realize there's more to this than just, will he get Andy McDowell at the end, right? It's interesting that Murray's beef is that Ramis lightened it up too much for mass consumption, because the reason it's such a cult celebrated phenomenon still to this day, one of the reasons so many people love it, is the darkness underlying the story, is the fact that there's this horrific element, this purgatory-like situation. And first of all, anybody who doesn't already know the plot of Groundhog Day, don't throw away this podcast, but pause it.
And just watch
and
the
go
fucking
watch
movie.
Groundhog Day. There are
It's not
certain
gonna be hard
movies
to
I don't
find.
mind spoiling, but this is a movie that you don't want spoiled.
Yeah.
So go away and come back, because we have lots to say. But see the movie. So we probably don't need to dive too far into the plot, right? But there is a darkness in the
meteorologist
notion
named
of being
Phil
trapped.
is reliving this Groundhog's Day in Puxatawney, this small town which he initially hates.
Yeah.
And he is forced to relive this day over and over and over again. The first 20 minutes or so of the movie is a fairly detailed accounting of his first day, so we peripherally get to know the characters that we are going to consequently see again and again and
Correct.
again.
And we get to know them in drips and drabs over the course of the movie through his interactions with them.
The function of the plot is a tricky one to sustain because of the nature of the repetition. You can wear an audience out. Another movie we're going to talk about later, that Live, Die, Repeat, handles this problem in a pretty clever way as well. But as the days drip by, we'll only see seconds of each individual day at a time. Sometimes we'll skip weeks, months, years.
We're not sure.
One of the great
There's
debates
debate even among the filmmakers as to how long Bill Murray's trapped in Groundhog Day.
My guess is that Bill Murray didn't like the idea that the way to get out of this was to, find true love. He liked the idea of it being, more of a personal journey, and that the romantic thing should have been in the background, and that the scary sort of Twilight Zone thing should have been in the front. And that, as far as he's concerned, Ramis got it wrong.
Well,
I don't know that. I haven't personally spoken to Bill Murray, so I'm totally pulling that shit out of the air. But
far be it from me to, Bill Murray's in the bloody movie.
Yeah.
Right? His opinion is pretty dang valid next to mine.
Yeah.
I can't say I agree with him that Ramis got it wrong. Right? I kind of like the fact that the deeper meaning of this movie is tucked behind a rather innocent-looking romantic comedy story.
More people watch this movie because it was made more palatable to the masses. And
Absolutely.
I don't think you'll hear me saying that in a positive way a lot in the podcast, but I'll definitely say that about this is not an easy meal to feed somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So package it as a romantic comedy, and people will come out thinking.
They strike a pretty good level, too. It's tricky to make us... I mean, Phil is this flawed character. It's not explicitly said, but it's understood by the audience, and eventually, I think, by Phil, at least in the way the movie is cut, that he kind of has to get this day right in order to unlock things. He has to live this day...
Perfectly. Basically.
Yeah, he has to live this day right. Maybe there is no exact perfect way to do it, but he's clearly not getting it right because he's doing it over and over. He tries everything, and he gets to know every breath taken by every person, right? We were talking about... We were just guessing about how long you would have to be there to memorize each gust of wind.
Yeah.
And memorize... And he
learned to play
musical
piano.
Instruments, and et cetera, et cetera.
I think he learns a language, doesn't he? He speaks French or something at one
maybe
point.
Maybe several.
Yeah.
And he role plays characters. He
knows the intimate secrets and life story of every single individual of that town.
Ramis, apparently, we were reading that at one point he said that it might span 10,000 years that Phil is trapped in Punxsutawney.
Yeah.
He, revised that to be a more real-world estimate of 10 years. He seems to have such intimate knowledge of everybody's thoughts and what they say and do that he's been there long enough to become a demigod, right? Like, he is plugged into that day. So it's interesting that he got there before going crazy, because how long would a human being be able to stay sane? And I imagine there were some interesting discussions between, Danny Rubin, who co-wrote it with Ramis, between the two of them about what happens first. You go insane and blow your brains out? Well, yes you do, because then you just wake up on Groundhog Day.
Well, this is where we get to how deep this movie can really end up being.
Even this fluffy Bill Murray that he doesn't like, Phil...
You get to the point where you're living the quote-unquote ideal American life or whatever, where you got the 9-to-5 job and you're in your cubicle from 9 to 4 every day. One day does become just like the last, and you are kind of reliving the same day over and over again. And that's why all of a sudden, when you bump into a friend of yours, you can't believe that it's been 6 weeks since you've seen him, because your head's been down in the sand.
Yep.
Basically, he's been slapped out of that malaise. He's aware of it now. And all of a sudden, being aware that he's living this same day forces him to change. Yeah. And without being cosmically forced, he wouldn't.
No,
he would just remain this dick. He's kind of an amusing dick, by the way, in the way Bill Murray can only do.
Only Bill
but
can do it.
He is an asshole. It's a fine line to walk, in that he's an asshole of a character, but we still find him sort of charming. I don't know who could have done that as well as Bill Murray.
And if they... Now, I don't know if Murray wanted to darken what happened to Phil more, or if Murray wanted to darken Phil.
Right.
Because if you darken Phil much more than he is, you wouldn't like him anymore.
Yeah.
And you're
It'd be
right.
hard
They
to
strike
sympathize.
that balance in fact, I was holding my fingers crossed from earlier in order to say that they strike a good balance of making Phil irritating, and you can tell that he's a sort of broken individual. He's got some issues, right? But you still like Phil enough to want him to get out of Groundhog Day, right? Would the cosmos lock all of us in our day of indecision and force us to live it over and over again until we got it right? The world would probably be a better place if each of us had our Phil experience, where we got stuck in a day and the universe just made us straighten out our shit before we were allowed to pass go, right?
Well, and the flip side of the Phil perspective is Punxsutawney itself. I think they do a really great job of this being a, quote, sort of charming town, but that fine line between small town quaint and like super toxic, whereas like it's fun place to visit,
well,
but if you can't
right,
leave,
because Punxsutawney is where, like, it's not just a small town; it's where
It's
the
the
official
Groundhog
groundhog
Day
lives,
town.
right? But Punxsutawney is in the festival a stand-in for every town in America, right? All of America looks to that town, and so Punxsutawney itself is like every town USA. They might as well call it that. At least that's how I think of it. I've never been to Punxsutawney, so I can't know. The movie maybe it's because of how much I like the charming elements of the movie. I do not always like Andie MacDowell.
Right.
I
She's
really
totally
like
good in
Andie
that.
MacDowell in this movie, and I kind of enjoy the datey stuff between them. The romance between the two of them is nice, and I don't often even sitting through that kind of thing in a movie because it's usually not done very well. There usually isn't believable chemistry between the two characters.
Yeah.
I dig that neither Bill Murray nor I just said her name,
Andie MacDowell.
Andie MacDowell are. Neither of them are, they're both handsome enough people, but also neither of them are supermodels. They're both
well, to be fair, Andie MacDowell was
people.
a
Andie
supermodel.
MacDowell was a supermodel, but she's not a 21-year-old ingenue.
Right.
I guess is what I'm saying. She's a believable-looking woman.
It's not
She's
Bill Murray
not
with
all-
Scarlett Johansson.
Exactly.
for
She's
instance.
not all Hollywoody slutted up. She's a believable, attractive woman. She's
Mhm.
obviously supposed to be sort of halfway out of Phil's league,
Yeah.
kind of thing until he. Well, she's well out of his league until he straightens out his stuff.
She's earnestly and regularly nice in the same way that Phil is earnestly and regularly shitty. No matter how shitty Phil is, she still smiles and puts up with it and is generally good-natured in a way, like almost a doormat, really. But, she's producing the show and there's the talent and, she's doing her job. It would be a hard walk for him to get from where he starts to where he ends up with her, and that's the whole point.
I think it's actually important that the movie feels like a rom-com when you sit down to watch it. And here's why. Phil looks at the problems in his life as how do I get the Andie MacDowell of the day to like me, right?
Yeah.
And how do I solve that problem? How do I, at the end of the day, have the woman I want in my bedroom with me, right? And the answer to that problem is you're solving the wrong problem. The
Fix
answer
yourself.
is fix yourself, and then the happy bit with Andie MacDowell is an addendum. And that sort of trickery doesn't function as well if you go in as a sort of lost in translation. This is a dark, moody kind of. No, this is a romantic comedy. Is he going to get Andie MacDowell? Oh, that's actually not the story. That's not the important thing for Phil to do. She's a tertiary element, really.
Yeah. To kick open one of the other endless doors of this repeating day, he said that it's amazing it didn't drive him crazy. Who's to say it didn't? He does commit suicide
He does.
several times, and who's to say he didn't have several months just laying in bed drooling? But it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, he still wakes up in
no
that
matter
same
what.
fucking bed. Like, there's genuine horror to that. Like,
Yeah, like,
he
tries to-
cannot even end his life.
And he can't leave.
Yeah.
Right? He
has to solve it.
He's got to solve it. He's forced. And it really does beg the question of how, what would a person do? How long would it take a person to conquer their like deepest shit if the universe held a gun to your head?
I'm sure it would become...
Took Phil a couple centuries, I think, at least. That's what Rubin, is that what his name is? Co-writer?
Yes.
No. Yeah, Danny Rubin. I was thinking Dave Rubin, but he's the interviewer. But Danny Rubin, he said about 100 years. He
Right.
thinks that Phil was there. And
But it's-
Ramis vacillated between 10 years and 10,000.
But unlike when we're talking with Cube, it doesn't bother me that they don't conclusively tell us that. In fact, I think it's kind of fun to do the math,
And thank you for bringing me back to that, because I'd forgotten to and I wanted to mention it. It's a perfect example. What I said about Cube was that extra thing that you don't address can't be more interesting than what you address.
Right.
In this movie, how and why Bill Murray is stuck in Groundhog Day, did God do it? Did the mice do it? And
Why was he selected?
Exactly. That's not as interesting as Phil himself. And Phil facing this conundrum is more compelling somehow than getting out of the cube is compared to who built the cube.
Yeah. That's why this will remain a classic, because it's the rom-com that gets you to talk about endless philosophical things,
Mm-hmm.
It's a deep movie, and it doesn't look like it.
Well, here, I'll put it this way. You mentioned that I was a philosophy student once upon a time, and that's true. And the Philosophy Club used to do movie night. They probably still do. And I remember being intrigued. I had already seen Groundhog Day, but I'd never thought of it deeply
In
enough.
that context, yeah.
But yeah, it was on the poster for the Philosophy Club movie nights, right alongside movies like Blade Runner,
Yeah.
and then boom, Groundhog Day, and you go, huh? watch it again with that thought in mind, and there is so much going on in Groundhog Day that's easy to miss. And I like that. It's delightful to me when you bury such a great thing inside it, and the rest of it is pleasant. It's not hidden in there. It's just there. And presented to us like a pearl in a clam.
From the same creative pool that brought us Stripes, too. It was a pretty bold step forward, you gotta say. For the time this came out, this was a very high-concept comedy. And I often give a hard time to romantic comedies, so it's really refreshing for me to say on Rank and Review, for the record, here's a rom-com that I'm 100% behind.
Well, I know you love Ghostbusters.
I do.
And you know I love Ghostbusters. I love me some Ghostbusters. And screening it in my backyard was awesome.
Yep.
That was fantastic. But I would be hard-pressed if you took out some pliers and told me you were going to pull my teeth unless I could pick my favorite Harold Ramis movie.
Well, I've been right between
Ghostbusters and as far as scripts go,
right.
Between Groundhog Day and Ghostbusters,
right.
I would have a hard time choosing which is a better story.
It's those types of thoughts that keep me up at night.
It's those types of thoughts that created this podcast that you're listening to.
Is there anything else you want to say about Groundhog Day?
Probably.
We could just spend a fucking episode on it.
Let's cut it there. If I think of something super important, I'll hack into your podcast website and plan something.
Throw it into the ranks.
What are you doing with this? You weren't supposed to bring this home. It belongs to the school.
But maybe it means something. Like a math puzzle or something.
Stay with me. I know how this sounds. But I've matched these numbers to the dates of every major global disaster for the last 50 years in perfect sequence. Earthquakes, fires, tsunamis. The next number on the chain predicts that tomorrow, somewhere on the planet, 81 people are going to die in some kind of tragedy.
So we've talked about Alex Proyas before, as you mentioned in the introduction, and he's one of these directors that I want to be a huge fan of, because I actually do think, especially visually,
Dark City.
He's an amazing director, and Dark City is a special piece of science fiction.
No matter what else he does, Dark City will always be excellent.
Yeah, and he, like I said in the introduction, he's just thrown a tantrum against critics after the dismal reception of his most recent film, which I'm not going to speak to, I haven't seen, but by all accounts, not super good. But, like I said, I appreciate his ambition. This movie got very, very mixed reviews, but one of its few great defenders was the late, great Roger Ebert. He basically said that this is his second sci-fi masterpiece. Whereas, I'm not going to say this is a sci-fi masterpiece. I am going to defend Knowing more than a lot of people do, because I so respect the ambition of the movie, and I really respect that they held a very big secret in the movie out of the whole campaign. This was the age where movies like 2012 and The Day After Tomorrow and huge disaster movies were very, very popular. And the fact that this movie is about the end of the world
and doesn't play that card in the trailer
and it's not present anywhere. They hit us with that within the plot of the movie. And when I first saw the movie, I was genuinely surprised that that's where the movie was going, you know? It's set up to be this adventure, sort of sci-fi adventure tale where Nicolas Cage is trying to protect his son from unknown forces. His son opens a time capsule at his school and gets this page full of strange scratched out numbers.
Creepy messages.
Yeah, and he happens to notice, look, he's just curious guy, that one of the numbers strings out to happen to be the dates for 9/11.
The date and the body count.
And the amount of people who died. And from that, he starts extrapolating that these numbers are not random at all, and that they're predicting catastrophes. And this gets confirmed.
And there are not very many left.
And there is an end point to this list. And what the fuck is that supposed to mean? There's a movie that your brother and I are quite fond of, actually, called Timescape with Jeff Daniels, it kind of reminds me of this premise where he realizes that he's being visited by time travelers who like to go to places of famous catastrophes, which leads him to wonder, what the fuck are they doing in my town?
What's going on?
Right? So on top of him figuring out what this map means, his son is being stalked or haunted by these really creepy people.
Dudes, yeah.
And so he's got a lot of things to deal with. And for me, the problem with it, my problems with Knowing has to do with that sort of angle of the spooky men following the kids. And the fact that even though I have defended Nick Cage in the past, he is sleepwalking through this movie.
He's not there.
And it's unfortunate, because I think if he brought his A game, this might be the movie that Roger Ebert seemed to think it was. It's almost there, which makes it one of those most frustrating sci-fi movies, because it's close to being something really special.
Yeah, well, and even just listening to you talk about it conceptually makes me go, I want to watch that movie that Larry's talking about, because that's not really the Knowing I watched.
Yeah. So I think that it'll stand or fall on how you feel about Nick Cage to some degrees. If you're not a fan of Nick Cage, this is going to be fuel for that fire. And I agree, this is not a strong performance from him, and that's kind of heartbreaking.
Well, I'm a fan of both Nick Cages, right? I'm a fan of Nick Cage, the one whom we saw in Leaving Las Vegas and Bringing Out the Dead, and a number of movies where Nick Cage is just flabbergastingly good. Adaptation is amazing.
Yeah.
And then I'm also a fan of the other Nick Cage, which is, Nick Cage in a gorilla suit sucker punching a woman on YouTube, right? Like, Nick Cage is a meme of himself now, and I appreciate Nick Cage on both levels. But this is somewhere in between. It's neither crazy off the hook nonsense, nor is it a great performance.
He looks legit sleepy.
Phoning it in.
He looks like this is his 4th or 5th consecutive movie shoot, and he needed a little bit of a breather. It very likely would have been.
It's odd. You don't, even in a bad movie, you usually feel like Nicolas Cage is there. Like, he is committed to The Wicker Man. And I don't know why, because there's so much more to work with in Knowing, but I feel like Nick Cage was 110% there.
He was on board.
In Wicker Man, and maybe like 62% there in Knowing. And it's a shame, because Wicker Man is... that movie is poor.
So I was being very nice about the movie, but now I must acknowledge some problems.
Thank you.
When Nick Cage sort of realizes what the last end of the string of the numbers means as their exact coordinates, the first time he happens to be at the apex of the disaster is not because he figures it out. It's because he literally happens to be there in the middle of a traffic jam. Mm-hmm. And I know the whole movie again, and the whole theme of this is games of fate, but
it seems to be focused on his family.
Yeah.
So it's not totally illogical outside of the context of the movie.
But I would have liked it if he made that theory, are these coordinates, and he put himself there, and it actually played out.
Like with the subway, where he was trying to stop it.
He was trying to prevent it, exactly, and of course no one's going to believe him.
And that was a good sequence. That's a sequence. Now, was that in the preview? The crash of the subway killing the people? Okay.
Yeah.
So it was really
we saw
just
the planes crashing, and we saw the explosions and Nick Cage running. But the fact that this was going to be a global event, Armageddon thing, was held back.
When they figure out that the final body count that they thought was 33 is actually EE for everyone else, right? Like, everyone's gonna die.
Yeah, and that's where it gets so great for me too, because Nicolas Cage, once he makes that realization, knows that he can't do anything to save himself, but he thinks there's maybe a 1 chance in 1,000 he might be able to save his son. And that's what the movie becomes, and I fucking love the stakes of that.
Yeah,
and it's a powerful scene, even with Nick Cage at 60%, when he gives his son up to these alien creatures.
Well, that's the extra 2%. That gets him to 62.
Yeah, but the alien creatures kind of rub me the wrong way.
Well, it's got an Abyss problem, right? Yeah. Where I love it, well, not quite to the level of The Abyss, because The Abyss is... I love so much of that movie, and then it's got the huge problematic ending. And that's why the creepy people following his son need to be there, right? Otherwise it's just...
But they don't need to be creepy.
Deus Ex Machina when the aliens show up at the end without them, right?
They don't need to be as terrifying as they are.
Exactly, and they stand out like a sore thumb, and you can tell why the writer had to stick them in there as the precursor to the aliens coming and taking the kids away at the end, right?
And I like the idea. There's an alien planet has been watching us. They see that the end's coming for us. They can't save the planet, but they save enough people and enough children to reseed human population somewhere else. Mm-hmm. But they're looking for children for whatever reason. Nick Cage is not invited on the boat.
Not invited.
I just wish they would have...
Richard Dreyfuss.
Yeah. I wish that they would have been closer to Close Encounters in that respect and just left it with the ships leaving, because there's this New Eden shot that finishes the movie.
Running through the field.
Running through a field to this big tree of life.
Yay, everyone's dead.
And I mean, I understand them trying to make something nice and glorious and big, considering everybody in the world has died. But that moment didn't feel genuine to me. It was just like, oh no. Yes, they got put to a perfect Eden. They might as well have been delivered to heaven itself, right?
Now, I need to preface the criticism I'm about to lay out with the fact that I had not seen this movie before it was assigned in this podcast, right? And I've watched it only once, which is not a position I'm in with many of the movies that we've reviewed together. And it was like 8 months ago that I watched it. I think maybe the movie... That being said, I think part of why I don't have passionate feelings one way or the other about Knowing is that maybe it bit off more than it can chew, and it failed to do both of the things it was trying to do. It was trying to make a tight little what the hell is going on thriller where Nick Cage is trying to solve this mystery, almost like National Treasure style thing, except without all the dorky...
Hopefully significantly
less hokey, right? Yeah. Which when you're going into an Alex Proyas movie, you're hoping it's not going to be too hokey, and usually isn't. But then it also tries to do the end of the world, aliens, Close Encounters thing, and sandwiches them together into one movie that ends up being, for me, it was pretty forgettable. I had to read the Coles notes to remind myself of what happened in the movie, right? Like, we had to sit here for a
You're not alone. I realize I have a minority opinion, and even, like, this is like a B- review for me. It's not like an enthusiastic thing, but I love the ambition of this movie. I love what this movie is trying to be.
Well, I enthusiastically beat the shit out of iRobot with you.
Yeah,
we were
and
crueler
it's
to
so
that movie
much better
than probably
than
we needed to be, but and this movie's not pissing on sacred source material the way iRobot did, and that's maybe the big difference. This movie was just trying to tell a story that its greatest sin is maybe that it tried to do too much, and the big problem with the movie is probably Nick Cage's lackluster performance.
Either get Nick Cage on a better day or recast that role, and it's like, it's that frustrating almost.
It's the frustrating almost, and it's the frustrating Cage, man. The Nicolas Cage-ness of the erratic nature of why is he so good in Lord of War and so mediocre in this movie? Why is he better in National Treasure than he is in this movie? I should mention before we move on, because we're just about done on this one, I think, right? That I only recently realized that due to a new piece of movie news, which is that Nicolas Cage is starring in the new Mario Van Peebles telling of
the
Indianapolis. That since I worked with Mario Van Peebles once upon a time in Toronto, so I'm now professionally only 1 degree of separation away from Nicolas Cage, the greatest living actor.
Yeah.
I don't know why that makes me happy,
but there it is.
There it is.
I still leave some hope for Alex Proyas.
Yes.
And I hope the fact that he just laid this huge egg is not going to stifle him from getting another at-bat, because, maybe he's a little bit pretentious, and he's made some problematic movies. But because he made Dark City, and because I know he's ambitious, and he wants so much to be the guy to give us that next Blade Runner, or give us that next Aliens, I want him to do it.
But we harp on this so much, so I don't want to hit the nail too hard, because the movie's fine. But he maybe needs some adversity. He maybe needs someone to say, you know what, we can only afford to either do the end of the world thing or the solve the mystery thing. One or the other, Alex, because Dark City's still by far his best work, and it's by far his lowest budget. And maybe there's a certain George Lucas factor going on where he's got too many toys at hand, and I'm going to make a movie that does all of this stuff, and it's just it's too much. And it was pretty long too, wasn't it?
It's 2 hours.
2 hours. It shouldn't feel as long as it felt, clocking in at 2 hours. But
again, minority opinion, I say give it its day in court. I know there are people who fucking hate this movie.
Well, I don't hate it. None of these are terrible movies.
It was on some people's worst of lists, and it was on some people's best of lists, which I think means that at the very least it's interesting.
I'm surprised to hear that it's on very many of either of those. I feel for myself that it's a fairly middle-of-the-road movie.
I'm going to tell you a story. At first, it's going to sound ridiculous. But But the longer I talk,
We have to find the keys.
the more rational it's going to appear.
I can't believe you found coffee.
Sugar, right?
Yeah.
Hold on. 3. You like 3.
How many times have we been here? How many times?
For me, it's been an eternity.
This is not the end.
The invasion will fail. We lose everything.
This is not the end.
I die within 5 minutes of landing on that beach, along with every other soldier.
How did you do that?
Come on!
Come find me when you wake up!
So Paxton, imagine Groundhog's Day if instead of Bill Murray, it was Tom Cruise, and instead of him reliving Punxsutawney's Groundhog Day festival, he was reliving basically an alien version of Omaha Beach over and over and over again.
Sounds familiar to me. I think there's a movie about that, Larry.
This is a special effects extravaganza from Doug Liman, the guy who brought us Go in the first Bourne movie. He's usually a fairly efficient director. It sort of a lot depends on the script with him, but he's definitely, a talented man.
Mm-hmm.
This is a movie that I got my hands on for free. I kind of got around to seeing it. I was never particularly amped. It's just, Tom Cruise has been around for so long that there's going to be 2 or 3 Tom Cruise action thrillers out every year. And it gets for me harder and harder to get excited about the next Tom Cruise project. And I would be lying if I didn't say the thing that made me, decide to finally check out Live, Die, Repeat was this premise that we're going to watch Tom Cruise die over and over again. So I didn't come in with a lot of expectations, which is why I'm pleasantly surprised to say that I'm a big fan of this movie. I mean, it's not deep. It's a sort of popcorn extravaganza, and it borrows all of these plot, things blatantly from other movies. But as far as being an exciting sci-fi action adventure, it works way more than it doesn't. So I'm going to give a conditional thumbs up to Live, Die,
Conditional
Repeat.
depending on what I say? Or
Yeah, no. For what it is. I mean, it's just asking, what does this movie want to be?
Well,
it wants to be a big action spectacle. And I
Yes.
think in a very basic, by-the-numbers way, it succeeds in being that.
I agree. I think it also wants to be a sort of clever action spectacle. It wants to have some interesting plot things going on. Now, you've already grabbed half of my talking points.
I'm
You and
sorry.
I are going, no, that's fine. You and I are going to agree a lot on this
Okay.
movie, I think. I wanted to point out that, just like you, I went into this movie with absolutely no expectations.
Yeah.
I had not seen a whole lot of the promotional material for the movie going in. I knew nothing about it except that Tom Cruise is in a robot suit and he's sort of dying a bunch.
It's Groundhog's Day.
Because the movie was, we're going to have to mention it at some point, originally called Live, Die, Repeat.
Or Edge of Tomorrow.
Or Edge of Tomorrow, rather,
Yeah.
and then was changed to Live, Die, Repeat.
Correct.
I thought it was the other way around.
No, it was changed to Live, Die, Repeat for its video release here.
I see.
But it was, when it was originally released theatrically, it was called Edge of Tomorrow.
Well, I was going to say that they stepped away from the better title, but apparently no, they stepped into the better title. I think Live, Die, Repeat is a much stronger title than Edge of Tomorrow.
I think some people believe that that's the reason that it didn't make as much money domestically as it should have. Like, if John Carter was called John Carter of Mars, that would have somehow rescued that movie from box office oblivion. It's just some weird suit mask in this studio system.
Well,
like
Live, Die, Repeat was in no danger of being a huge bust, right?
Right.
The movie was a slow burn, but it did make a bunch of money.
It did well enough to get a
internationally.
sequel. So.
Yeah, exactly. And it even ended up breaking 100 million domestic. We
Yeah.
just looked up as well. And but so I'm pleasantly surprised that the sequel's greenlit and purportedly getting made.
Yeah.
Because the movie was, to me, really entertaining, and we'll talk more about why. But one of the reasons I enjoyed it, that's not a criticism of the movie one way or another, so we'll just spit it out, is that it's the first time you and I have watched a movie for the podcast together for the first time.
Yeah, neither of us had seen it before. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
And I haven't seen it since, so I think we're both talking about this movie after just one viewing.
pass.
And Larry and I, we rarely watch any movies together for the first time, unless we go to see it in the theater, right? So this was a fun time sitting down and watching it together,
and we were rolling the dice.
We were rolling.
The other thing to say, because I can't stop talking about Tom Cruise, is that as a personality, as a celebrity, as the entity of Tom Cruise, he's kind of a very make-fun-of-able figure.
Make-fun-of-able,
right?
Yes, he is.
I mean, there's a better word than that, but that's what I'm going to say. He's very make-fun-of-able. And here's what I will say. Tom Cruise is a decent actor. He sells the premise. I believe the stakes. I believe it when he's scared. And for somebody that I've seen on screen so much, like, I will give him his due credit. Maybe he's half crazy or completely crazy in real life.
Fully crazy.
But he doesn't suck as an actor.
No, he doesn't. And Tom Cruise helped this movie, and part of why is that Tom Cruise was in it, so I went in expecting nothing. Right? I went in expecting another banal Tom Cruise action movie, which it very easily could have been. But it was smart enough, and it moved enough. One thing that Doug Liman can do very well is make a movie that steps forward at an invigorating pace.
Yeah.
Go did that in spades, and this movie does that very well. That you start into the movie and you're, dropping onto the beach with Tom Cruise. It's exciting enough. I was already with the movie, and then I think you and I both clicked on the movie at the same moment, which is when we realized that he's not the only Billy Pilgrim who's come unstuck in time, right? The plot is that he's reliving the same day, Groundhog Day style, and when I realized that the movie was going one level deeper than that, and there was someone else, and he reaches out and makes contact. And the movie just got an extra level of interesting for me at that point, and I remember sitting forward on my seat and going like, okay,
it moved
the
a
movie's
step
going
deeper
now.
than the video game premise. Is like basically his every movement on the battlefield, anytime he steps on a mine or sees somebody in the wrong place at the wrong time, tomorrow he can fix it.
But it happened just as I thought that I kind of had the movie figured out, and I'd seen what the movie was going to show me, and the rest was going to be explosions.
Emily Blunt
at that
sees
point,
him,
the movie took this other step, and the pep of the movie kept going.
Emily Blunt, who we haven't mentioned yet, sort of played in our badass war hero. She sees him on the battlefield and recognizes what's happening because it's something that had happened to her. So as she sees her doom coming, she turns to the main character, to Tom Cruise, and says, Find me when
tomorrow.
you wake up.
Yeah, find me when you wake up.
And that's when we get past the video game premise, and now we're going to see, that's when the video game kicks into plot mode, right? And now what are you going to do with this power?
Right. So unlike Bill Murray, Tom doesn't have to live the same day over and over and become a better person.
Yeah.
He has to live the same day over and over and become a better soldier and better understand the enemy that they're fighting. That's their real value in this effort, is that it turns out their reliving of the same day is tied into the technology of the aliens they're fighting, right? They control time, etc., etc.
Over that sort of sci-fi construct, I actually really liked how they handled the action sequence. The aliens are very aggressive. They kind of reminded me of the Sentinels from The Matrix, but they were living creatures more than robotics. Obviously.
Yeah, they actually ended up sort of being reminiscent when I saw the Rathtars in the new Star Wars movie.
Oh, yes.
I was like, hey, that's sort of live, die, repeat going on there.
Yeah, oh, well, I see that. I totally see that.
Yeah.
The thing that starts the ball rolling is Tom Cruise's character talks his way into the front lines by, asking a favor of the wrong general.
Yeah.
And he's basically, sentenced to death by being this guy who's completely incompetent is thrown into this whirlwind of shit.
Mm-hmm.
But the first and only alien that he encounters on the original day kills him as he kills it.
Yes.
And there's this horrifying moment where this blue neon blood sprays on Tom Cruise's face and just fucking melts it.
Yeah.
And because of that specific alien, and that alien is one of the creatures that has this ability, and because he died covered in that membrane material or whatever that shit was,
he's unstuck in time.
That's what that, and the same thing presumably happened to Emily Blunt, which is why she became this war hero.
It's been long enough ago that we watched it that I don't remember clearly if the movie implicitly tells us she got sprayed with alien explosion goop,
Yeah,
or
she does
if we
mention
just assumed it.
you died on the first day, but you killed this type of alien. And he said, yes. If it was the first time she was finishing his sentence, right?
So the fact that it happened to him is probably what helped her seal the deal that had happened to her as well.
And instead of having to...
That's right after, she sees that that's about to happen to him. Yeah.
And it's interesting because instead of being like Bill Murray, he doesn't have to... he has to have one conversation with her every morning, basically. And that convinces her, we need to train him. He has my same powers. There's no reason he can...
Unlike Tom, we get to skip the repetitiveness of that conversation over and over again. And unlike Bill Murray, Tom can't skip it. He can't just go hang out with other people that day. He has to go back and convince her every day.
But we talked about the narrative difficulty of having that recycling sort of storyline that goes over and over again. They helped themselves greatly by casting Bill Paxton.
Yes, whom I wanted to get to as well, so thank you. I felt like he stepped into the role of Apone from Aliens. He took off his Hudson boots and put on his Apone boots for this movie. And he made me wish that he'd been in... Well, I really liked him in this. It made me think, man, why couldn't he have been in Avatar playing this character? I might have been less bored through Avatar.
Well, he's almost always a welcome presence. I would say always, but unfortunately I reviewed a little movie called Club Dread. But usually Bill Paxton, I'm happy to see you. And he's like...
Whether
because
he's a
we
vampire
see his,
or a punk trying to beat up the Terminator, he's always fun.
We get to see him go from alpha to, this whipped little puppy. The first day with Tom Cruise, he's just totally putting him in his place, slapping him around. But when Tom Cruise has the days resetting on him, he just completely undresses him.
Yep.
So a scene that could have become tiresome because they cast the right actor, I think, became much more digestible.
Yeah, homie's got some skills. Bill Paxton he's good even in a lot of terrible movies.
Yeah.
I'll defend him in Twister even.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah, that's a special effect movie. Those are not easy to be in, man.
No. And it's also not easy to be in a movie directed by somebody who barely speaks English. Isn't it Jan de Bont who does not communicate well with his actors when they don't... Yeah. Anyhow, we're not here to talk about Twister. Let's jump back to the fact that there's a sequel happening.
Okay.
We don't know when it's happening. We know that...
Doug Liman is supposedly returning.
Yeah, and what's his name? The who wrote this first one? Christopher... McQuarrie. Yeah, is not writing the second one.
Right,
but I'm assuming Tom Cruise and what's her name? The female lead. You said her name
Emily
4
Blunt.
times already. Emily Blunt.
Yeah.
They won't be doing it again without them.
I would assume at the very least we'll get Tom Cruise back.
That'll be complicated to get her back, won't it?
It's hard to say. Who knows? Maybe they were anticipating it on being bigger. They might have signed sequel. Who knows?
Yeah. The movie seems to have just sort of slipped into existence, though. It slipped through the marketing mesh of... It just blended in with a lot of other sci-fi movies and action movies that all look like a bunch of explosions when you see the advertisements. But there was more going on in this movie than just a bunch of explosions.
In the same way, Groundhog's Day isn't just a romantic comedy. This just isn't just a popcorn action movie.
Right.
I would say that Groundhog's Day is still a much better movie of the two.
I would agree.
But I was surprised by this movie, and if nothing else, it accomplished something quite impressive. Because now I'm looking forward to a Tom Cruise
movie, which I have mixed feelings about. Right, like I'm not a fan of the Church of Scientology, and I'm not a fan of Tom Cruise for that purpose. And I usually have no problem keeping a creative person, an artist's personal business, out of my appreciation for their art. I can enjoy a Woody Allen movie, right? But for some reason, I feel a little bit guilty about putting money into Tom Cruise movies because I don't like where his money goes. But
for me, it's less.
This movie was free, so you didn't have to pay for it, and I got to watch your copy.
For me, it's less about Tom Cruise not getting out of the closet. It's I don't really particularly care about the Scientology more than but all sorts of people believe all sorts of crazy shit. For me, it's just I'm worn with use. Like I said, there's been at least 2 Tom Cruise action thrillers every year since 1988, right? Like it just got hard to get worked up about it. So I think genuinely that it seems like a left-handed compliment, but I will totally watch the sequel to this movie.
Absolutely, and I didn't want to derail it onto a whole debate. I'm just saying I feel like Scientology is a predatory cult scam, and Tom Cruise is knowingly the mouthpiece for it and has helped David Miscavige sell it, etc., etc. All I'm trying to say is that this movie was entertaining enough that I was able to put that stuff aside, which usually that stuff's enough to make me just not bother with Tom Cruise movies.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have watched this movie were it not for
the
Rank and
podcast.
Review.
There you go.
And so I'm glad, and I'm in the same position as you. I kind of want to see the sequel. I want to know what happens next. Good surprise. Watch it if you haven't.
Live, Die, Repeat, or Edge of Tomorrow, depending on where you are in the world.
That's right. Unless you haven't seen Groundhog Day, watch Groundhog Day before you watch this.
He's a loser.
Hey, Bernie!
You want to tell me what's going on out there? We're down almost $1 million out there. Doesn't that seem strange to you?
She loves me. Should I get her flowers or candy?
What is happening to you?
Get ready to experience...
I love the schmuck.
What is there to love?
...the year's most improbable love story.
You are out of his life.
I don't think I can do that.
This is our time. This is you and me.
William H. Macy.
You look in the mirror. You don't like what you see? Look in my eyes. I am the only mirror you're ever gonna need.
Maria Bello.
He blindsided me. I love you.
And Alec Baldwin.
The best cooler there ever was, and I need him back.
He ain't never coming back.
That is a dead man talking.
So I said there were 2 movies on the list that kind of stuck out. That didn't seem like obvious picks necessarily.
Right.
First one was Groundhog's Day. I would argue the second one is The Cooler. There is definitely a fantastical element to this movie, but it's not necessarily as front and center as everything else.
That's right.
The basic premise is that Alec Baldwin is an old school gangster who runs a casino. And because he's old school, he has in his employ this William H. Macy character who is a cooler. If there's somebody hitting the tables who's having a good run and the casino's starting to lose money, they have only to just have him stand next to them. And the next time he rolls the dice, shit's gonna take a turn.
He's a bad luck magnet.
He just is. He like, there's a vortex of bad luck that follows him everywhere he goes. It's like that kid from Charlie Brown's that has a fucking cloud around him, right? Big pen sort of thing.
Although he seems to, we don't learn until very late in the movie that he seems to actually be a sort of luck black hole, and that he sucks in everyone else's luck and accumulates and uses it all at once.
Well, and that's where things do kind of get crazy and supernatural, but for the most part the movie plays things very straight.
Right.
But the Alec Baldwin character definitely believes in this cooler. He's had him in his employ. And as an added convenience, William H. Macy had been a compulsive gambler, and most of his wages are being garnished by Alec Baldwin. Despite this, they seem to have a somewhat of a friendly relationship. They get along with each other. And a monkey gets thrown into their works on both of their lives. The Alec Baldwin's character has his own mob bosses that he needs to answer to, and they want this casino to be more profitable. It's turning a profit. It's even turning millions of dollars, but they want to play with the big boys, and in order to do that, they're going to make changes. And Alec Baldwin is not amenable to that. So his life is being forced to change, and there's not a lot he can do about it, and we see his struggle with it. And at the same time, that's mirrored by the William H. Macy's character. I think that Alec Baldwin's character meant well by hiring this waitress, played by the absolutely fucking gorgeous Maria Bello, basically to sleep with him. And this really weird thing happens. Maria Bello legit falls
in love
for this William H. Macy with the cooler. And it's got devastating consequences because his life starts turning around, and consequently his special ability no longer works. And on top of Alec Baldwin's character trying to fight for the old ways, his casino does start losing money. So that's where we start with this premise of the cooler.
It's a pretty out there premise.
Yeah. But it's original, and it sort of seems like it would be an interesting Twilight Zone episode. And I definitely think it would be. But I guess my question is it an interesting movie?
Certainly an interesting movie. It tonally and setting-wise, material-wise, it reminds me a great deal of another movie that I like very, very much, which is a little movie called Hard Eight.
Right.
But it's sort of like what if there were a Twilight Zone episode inside of Hard Eight, I suppose. Would be a way to describe this movie. I liked it.
Yeah.
I almost always, invariably, I like William H. Macy.
Mm-hmm. He's a charming presence.
I can't say that I invariably like Alec Baldwin, but I like him in this movie. And I even managed to like his character somewhat, in spite of the fact, and you and I discussed this a little bit earlier, that his character is pretty awful.
The world that he is nostalgic for is not a good thing. It reminds me of this
It's a world of broken kneecaps and intimidation tactics.
Old school hardcore gangsterism, right? That's more disguised now, but it's still a dog-eat-dog world. But yeah, he is struggling in the face of that. But it reminds me of sort of this... I don't know, right-wing idealism of the 50s. Like, there's this mentality that once upon a time, everybody got along, everybody got paid a living wage, and everything was hunky-dory. And it's bullshit. It doesn't really exist. Just like this idealized version of the casino doesn't really exist. But he's going to fight to the death to keep it that way. And his sort of journey is seeing everything change for the worse. And William H. Macy's journey is seeing everything sort of change for the better.
Yeah. And the movie makes it easy enough to root for the right guy, but the movie, it's a nuanced enough performance from Baldwin, and the character's written sympathetically enough that I feel a little torn about that character. What was his name?
Shelley.
That's right.
Yeah. One of the great things this movie is really getting you angry at certain characters. Shelley definitely does this a few times where you're really fucking mad at Shelley. You kind of, in a way, I guess I feel bad. That trajectory does work. He's not going to survive in this world and doesn't, and he sees his empire fall before, he's put down.
Shelley, yeah, he's an interesting character. I think Shelley might actually be the most interesting character as far as his own arc, right?
It's easier to relate to that than somebody who has this superpower, right?
Yeah. I mean, Bill Macy's got this luck magnet effect going on, and then his luck changes. Baldwin does his character, Shelley, does a couple of things, hiring the woman, first of all.
Yeah.
And then in the climax of the film, letting him run the table and pay off his debt and win all this money. And it's interesting that Shelley lets him do that. He's a principled enough man that even though he just wants to rip everything to shreds, he knows that he's losing and lets it happen.
Yeah.
He's interesting in that regard. He doesn't throw a tantrum and try and take him out anyway. He loses fair and square and swallows his pride.
We know he's willing to kill people. We know, he beats the Maria Bello character to try to convince her. When she says, no, I can't leave him, I love him. He brings out the fist. He is, uncompromised.
He's a piece of shit.
He's bad. He is bad.
But when push comes to shove, he could put a bullet in the back of Bill Macy's head. And instead, he lets him walk out of his casino with a ton of money.
And in a way, it's the one time he does make a change. The old school Shelley is uncompromising. Somebody says what William H. Macy says to him in his fucking casino.
Yeah.
And you're not living another day. Best case scenario, you're in a wheelchair tomorrow, right? And not only does he let him walk, when he sees him starting to win, when he sees the cooler walk to his table and start to clean out his casino, he holds back all the dogs. No. This man is going to take that money and you're going to fucking let him.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not completely earned, but I fucking love it in the movie when it happens.
It's a big surprise. You kind of don't expect that from Shelley, but he's that's the other side of him being such an old school gangster, right?
Yeah.
A debt owed is a debt that I'm going to pay. You pay your debts.
Yeah.
He's a bit of a Lannister in that regard.
Another interesting thing about this movie, there's a documentary called This Film Has Not Yet Been Rated, which talks about movies that have been raped by the MPAA. Which this movie kind of was.
Was that movie an MPAA rape victim? Was it forced R for something?
There is a sex scene. And
did a nipple ruin this movie's rating?
It was pubic hair. It was Maria Bello's pubic hair.
Yeah.
But they have a fairly frank and honest, fairly graphic sex scene. The first one is almost excruciating to watch because it's over so quickly and kind of humiliating for William H. Macy, but she's weirdly charmed by it. It's almost like she's taking his virginity. Yeah. He's not. He's a father, as we find out through the movie, but
he's so overjoyed to have the tenderness of a woman back in his life. She's charmed by that very fact.
It's so foreign to him that someone would be nice to him, even a little bit, let alone
he's
this
like an
movie.
Abused dog, the way Shelley treats him, right?
Yeah, but they have this whole fairly graphic sex scene. They have the unsuccessful sex scene, which I just described, and then we see them later on having progressed, where they're having really good sex, and they decided they were going to show that. And nobody maybe wants to see William H. Macy's saggy white man ass, but they cut a significant portion of that in the movie. I don't know how much it hurt the movie.
And did it still earn the hard R rating?
It got an
despite
R,
the cuts?
but it didn't get an NC-17, which would have killed it.
Would have buried it.
Yeah. So anyway, it's
And
interesting. The movie had some talking points over that, and unfortunately, most of the times when it came up, that was the thing that was the discussion. And what gets missed is that I think it's a pretty fucking decent movie. I do have a complaint, though.
What's that?
Again,
I think I know what it is, but I won't just jump into it and spoil it.
Spoiler tactic. We already talked about the fact that William H. Macy plays the tables. His luck turns so completely that he wins. And I think that turn of fate and that win of Shelley letting him leave and him being able to get in that car and drive away with Maria Bello,
that's where our movie ends,
was a satisfying ending. But instead they give us one more scene. And it doesn't sink the ship for me entirely, but I genuinely wish it wasn't there. We have a one-scene role from MC Gainey, who's a consummate character actor. Fans of Lost will know him as one of the others. And he poses as a police officer to try and steal the money back and murder them.
Yeah.
And fate intervenes. A drunk driver smokes him.
Yeah, he's pulled them over after they've been allowed to leave the casino with their winnings by Alec Baldwin, much to our surprise.
Yeah.
They're making what we think is a clean getaway. They get pulled over by a highway patrolman who's actually a gangster in disguise. This guy you're talking
MC
about.
Gainey, yeah.
MC Gainey.
But I just wish it wasn't there. It was just that one little
he gets
step
totally
too
Final
far.
Destination.
Yeah.
And I don't understand what it's there for is my problem with it. There must be a reason that the screenwriter has it in there.
Yeah.
But I can't for the life of me figure out what that reason would be. Can you?
It doesn't top what happened before it. It's not... The climax of the film has happened.
It doesn't inform what happened. It doesn't change any of the characters' decisions. It doesn't...
There's even a weird, almost embarrassed, desperate cut at the end of the scene where William H. Macy turns to Maria Bello and says, "It's just some weird, freaky accident," and the film just cuts out, directly after his line, "Please don't think too deeply about this." It's almost like they're apologizing for it as it happens.
Not only was that should the story end there, yes, but that it's a good ending. It's not just where the movie should end. If it ended there, it would be a strong ending.
Yeah.
I don't understand why anyone, whether it happened at the screenwriting stage or whether it was done later, hastily, they filmed some extra stuff on set, or what. I don't know why they were worried that their ending wasn't strong enough, and that why the screenwriter felt he needed this extra scene. Unless he was trying to say something else, add something to it. I don't get it, right?
Yeah.
I know the stories about luck and how luck changes, and there's a supernatural element, as we said at the beginning of this review, to how William H. Macy's luck seems to be
we live in a world of
universe,
magic.
Right? It's legitimate that he has terrible luck for decades, and that then one day it changes. It's not just statistical; it's every damn bet he makes.
Yeah.
Right? There's no way to discredit it. It's just the odds of it being anything but perfect magic are infinitesimally small. It can't be anything else but magic.
I want to quickly mention 2 supporting roles in the movie, which I like. I'm a big fan of Ron Livingston.
Yeah.
He was in, obviously...
Watching this movie made me think, oh yeah, I wish Ron Livingston had sort of disappeared. He made this and Office Space and Swingers. And
Band of Brothers is what I love him for. Yeah.
And,
a lot of people are all about Office Space, and I like that movie, but I just love his character in Band of Brothers so much.
Office Space is just where I first... Well, no, Swingers is where I first really noticed Ron Livingston, but Office Space is so hilarious.
And it's sort of not your typical Ron Livingston role, right? He's a gangster, but he's not a heavy, but he has a lot of weight behind him. He might not be able to deal with Shelley one-on-one, but he can make a phone call.
He represents forces who are far out of Shelley's league. The guys who own Shelley, right? He's the corporate face of gangsterdom.
And I like it when they take a typically comic actor and give him a different role. And I think he did well enough with it. He gets his arm broken really brutally by Alec Baldwin in a bathroom, and I really like that scene because as much as Alec Baldwin's not being smart, we really enjoy watching Ron Livingston scream like a little child when his arm gets broken. The other person I wanted to mention was Paul Sorvino.
Yes.
He plays this singer who's been, periodically coming in the club forever and ever and ever. And there's an interesting relationship between he and Alec Baldwin because what Alec Baldwin is seeing in this character is his future. This is a relic who no longer belongs to this world anymore. And Alec Baldwin tries to make it like it was for him, and says that a girl left her underwear hanging on the door of his dressing room, and, you know, the old man sees right through it and says, just pay me with drugs.
Yeah.
I don't want your pity, I want the gear. And that is the thing too far for Alec Baldwin's character. He's like, well, once he knows that he's past his prime, the thing to do is to let him die with whatever dignity he has left.
Yes.
And he gives him a bad batch and fucking kills the guy. And in Alec Baldwin's head, in Shelley's head,
somehow he twists that into an act of compassion.
It was a compassionate thing. And it's just such a cool thing. Paul Sorvino is actually a very good singer. And because you know him from like Law and Order and Goodfellas, you just don't expect this guy to be a crooner. And
right.
He is
and
legit.
He's straight up crooner, yeah.
It's not a big role. He's not in the movie a lot, but I just wanted to give him a shout out. And for these reasons and many others, I think, you know, it's a movie a lot of people missed. Even though Alec Baldwin was nominated for Academy Award for it, a lot of people missed the cooler. And
the other shout out in there is that Joey Fatone is in it.
Thank you. I would have fucking lost sleep over
It's Backstreet Fame or NSYNC? Which of those is Joey Fatone?
I wish
from?
I could tell you.
Joey Fatone is in there, though.
Yeah.
Watch carefully when you watch The Cooler. Like I said earlier, none of these movies are terrible. Some of them are better than others. The Cooler is one of the better movies in this group. I think it's a strong movie. Yeah, we'll get to it soon in the rankings. Watch The Cooler, though.
Agreed.
I got this feeling. It's a weird feeling. The cabin starts to shake, right? And the left side blows up, and then the whole plane just explodes. The plane's gonna explode! It's not a joke! It's not a joke!
We get thrown off the plane all because Brownie has a bad dream?
I saw it.
The plane! It's gonna blow up! It's gonna blow up!
All 287 passengers are feared dead.
Because of you, I'm still alive.
In death, there are no accidents. No coincidences. And no escapes.
Did it happen again? Did you see Todd die?
What if it was our time? What if we were not meant to get off that plane? What if there is a design?
Well, its premise is both its good and bad quality, right? Basically what we're looking at here is a slasher movie without a slasher, right? Devon Sawa plays this teenager who's going on a school trip to Paris, and he has a vision that shows in grim detail a catastrophic accident on board the plane during takeoff, which kills everybody on board. He wakes up from his vision, flips out, and he and several of his friends are ejected from the plane, and the plane does indeed explode. And fate intervenes to slowly, one at a time, kill off the survivors.
The people who weren't supposed to survive.
They weren't supposed to survive. It was their time.
Yep.
And the problem with this intangible enemy is just that. How do you fight something that is invisible? How do you fight the power of fate itself?
Have to turn fate into a shadow so that the characters can glimpse it moving around,
unless,
which they literally do.
Unless it manifests itself as a Freddy Krueger creature that says, I am fate, or I am death, which I don't think we wanted either.
Or, I'm Scary Terry, bitch.
Yeah, but they paint themselves into a corner instantly here.
Yes.
Like, what's this epic showdown? What could it possibly be? And I noticed in this movie something that I don't remember seeing in any of the sequels, which just sort of increasingly turn into these, like, Rube Goldberg splatterfests, where it's all about, how's this idiot gonna die, right? Which is what slasher movies are. But
they just get increasingly complex and zany. It becomes zany in pretty short order. Like, I would say before the first movie is over, they've already become inordinately complex, these disasters that befall the survivors.
But the thing that gets you to watch these movies isn't how are they going to beat death. It's how are they going to die.
Correct.
Right? So it's not high art for that.
No.
And this movie has an element that I don't recognize in the other ones, in that it seems like death was trying to cover its tracks. Like making things look like a suicide, at least initially.
Mm-hmm.
Or, having people explode so the weird circumstances of their death are covered up, The
hardest thing for me to believe about the movie is that they figured out that they were being stalked by death because they shouldn't have survived the plane, right? Like, that's a stretch to be, and then the fact I can believe a world where these people think that's what's happening. What's amazing to me is that they think it's happening and it's actually happening, and that both of those things are true at the same time. I can kind of imagine it happening and them not realizing it. I can kind of imagine them thinking it's happening, but really it's just bad luck.
I also noticed
they figured it out, that they were being systematically hunted by
it's
the
very
Grim
TV.
Reaper itself.
It's very TV.
It is, and that will bring us back to Glenn Morgan and James Wong, who before this movie went into production were making a television show called Millennium.
I had been working in television basically exclusively. He did a movie called The Boys Club a little bit before this, but
which I haven't seen.
It's Chris Penn hanging out with some kids in a treehouse.
Okay.
Anyway, I felt the influence of both the structure of television writing. And
there are commercial breaks in the movie.
There's moments that feel like insert commercial here, and worse than that, there are scenes where they seem to need to recap the previous
setting up
episode.
what happened 20 minutes ago.
Just in case you forgot during the commercials, this is whose funeral it is, and this is why these two people have to have this conversation. It feels the need to kind of constantly be reorienting us. I don't know if they were thinking because they were aiming at a teen date night audience that they needed to spoon feed us a little bit, but it felt TV.
Yeah,
and it that's neither here nor there, I guess. I like watching television, but it's a movie, and they didn't make that leap completely successfully for me. Like it felt like a TV movie, and it wasn't.
They didn't make the leap at all. They made a 90-minute television show, and it got projected on a big screen and was a big hit because of the gimmick of these kids being hunted by fate. It sort of.
And if it was a 44-minute episode of X-Files or Millennium, where that was
That's what I wanted to be. And it probably even started as a Millennium script. I wouldn't be surprised if we were
spec
to
script for X-Files or Millennium that they just blew up into their feature.
Right.
You know?
They'd been working on X-Files. We just looked it up as early as '93, and they took over Millennium entirely for the second season, while Carter did the X-Files movie and went back to the X-Files after starting Millennium. Made what I think was a season of television that was 2 decades ahead of its time and was a commercial failure because there was no way for people to watch it. They didn't have Netflix yet, and you couldn't miss an episode of the second season of Millennium and understand what the hell was going on.
It was great TV, but it wasn't watched by enough people.
Right, and but we watched it. We watched the hell out of that show, and maybe that's part of my uppityness about Final Destination.
We know they're capable of better than this.
Right, and so here I was sitting down to watch this movie that's sort of picking a scab off of the fact that one of my favorite television shows ever had its ending ripped away from it in many ways. And them leaving had nothing to do with why the show fell apart and didn't get any kind of satisfactory ending. I don't blame Morgan and Wong for that. But the stuff I knew them for before Final Destination was Millennium, Space Above and Beyond, which I think deserves more love than it ever got, that kind of thing, and
X-Files,
I can't name you anything they've done since.
Well, that's where the sad story kind of continues, because I'm cheering for these guys too, because I love that second season of Millennium specifically too. I can't go with you into season 3, but
no, I'm not a big fan either.
But
I'm holding seasons 2 and 3 of Millennium in my hands. In my left hand, Millennium Season 2, because it's a great thing that I admire and love. Season 3, because it represents everything wrong with the way TV was made in the 90s, and it represents, my right hand could be holding a much better thing in it if Final Destination didn't exist.
Yeah, and that's not a fair thing to hang on the movie as why I don't like it.
Right,
but
I'd
be
wish
lying
I
if I
was
wouldn't
in
say
that reality. I would rather have them produce another season of Millennium than make this movie, and I know that the movie's not responsible for them leaving the show, but I feel like one could have existed and would have been better.
Yeah, but unfortunately this went on to a high concept but I think low quality Jet Li sci-fi picture, The One, and then 2 remakes, one of which I think is fairly strong, called Willard, with Crispin Glover and a bunch of rats, and one of which I'm afraid to say is outright terrible, called Black Christmas. And as far as I know,
he made Willard, because I liked Ben.
Yeah,
and I just remember thinking Willard was weird.
Well, this is a remake, the one with Arlie Ermey and Crispin Glover.
Anything with Crispin Glover in it ends up feeling weird.
But I have a soft spot for it because of how weird it is, I guess. But I kind of want to be saying, these guys were going to go on to greater things. But as it turns out, I think that season 2 is going to be their high water mark of Millennium, and I'm glad that they made big bank off of Final Destination. They had like this whole series, and apparently they're gonna like reboot it. Somehow, in spite of the fact that it's just a slasher movie without a killer, it spawned a franchise. And as a fan of horror franchises, I am mystified by the success of, like, I don't hate this movie, but I'm amazed that it spawned this whole
series of sequels, and that it didn't spawn any huge careers. I mean, the movie's full of people that you expect in 1999 they were walking around thinking that this was going to be their big into Hollywood, and then it was wildly successful. And then very few of them lasted more than another couple of movies after that, right? The main lead is Devon Sawa, and he went on to do, you said Black Hawk Down. What else did we think he was in?
That was the only one that I could remember off the top of my head. I think he did it in the 90s. Before this, he did a semi-popular movie called Idle Hands.
Yeah. And it feels like the casting call went out for most 90s kid ever for this movie, right? We need the 90s every kid.
I think that they underweight the sort of gravity of the amount of death that they are subjected to at the beginning, too.
People adjust pretty well to the plane crash. They're over the plane crash and worried about death stalking them in rather short order.
It's like in between the imaginary commercial break. They lick their wounds.
They figured it out. They put the pieces together.
But that's it's well enough made, and it's good for what it is, but it's like a total C movie. And if you're looking for a thriller to watch, I guarantee you can do better than Final Destination.
That's right.
But truth be told, you can do a lot worse.
Well, when I wrote down my ranking at the beginning of this episode, and after we hit stop before we actually do the rankings, I'm going to take a look and make sure I still agree with it after our conversation. But I subjected this movie to the did it accomplish what it set out to do test. And I won't answer that question right now.
Yeah.
But yes.
So you will answer that question right now.
Exactly. Fate made me answer the question just then.
Yeah.
The movie more or less accomplishes what it set out to do. It didn't aim very high.
Yeah.
But I'd still rather have that second season of Millennium. I wouldn't stop anybody from watching Final Destination. I don't regret watching Final Destination. I had fun watching it with you.
Yeah.
But Final Destination is one of those movies that if you have anything going on in your life, you can skip it. It's not the closest this list comes to a bad movie necessarily, but it's going to come low in my ranking.
As I've said before in the podcast, and this is like the faintest of praise, but if you were on a plane, and it was on, it'll distract you for 90 minutes.
Particularly the upsetting plane crash sequence. Speaking of which, I think that might be the last really graphic plane breaking up in mid-flight sequence that we got before 9/11.
Yeah, you might be right about that.
That was late in 2000, I think that movie came out. Like, was it a holiday thing? Was it?
I can't remember.
I don't remember when it was released in the year either, but it was definitely 2000.
Yeah.
And there seemed to be a number of plane crash movies that had really visceral, believable, upsetting plane crash sequences, and then that sort
people
of
not just explodes, people burning
people
alive,
getting sucked out,
and
and that is something that went away from movies for quite a while after 9/11.
And credit where credit is due, it was well done in the movie, and it's a primal fear that everybody has. Like, I don't want to necessarily drive to Vancouver, but even though it's way more dangerous to drive to Vancouver than to fly, I feel safer in the car than I do in the plane.
I also just, particularly driving to Vancouver,
it's a beautiful
driving
ride.
through the mountains is such a beautiful drive. But I take your point.
Yeah.
Okay, watch it on a plane. I watched Waterworld on a plane, and I'm still here and alive somehow. So you can definitely get through Final Destination.
And if you see what it was in this movie that made it spawn the franchise, please write me at Rank and Review and let me know what you thought that was, because it surprises me. It's right up there with Children of the Corn, and that, like, why are there 9 Children of the Corn movies? I just don't understand.
Some idea of why, and I think it might be. We don't need to dwell on it for too long, but tell me what you think. The slasher genre kind of played itself out in the late 80s, early 90s. It had begun to run out of steam, and we got a decade with few big slasher movies.
Well, and the ones that were winking. They were all Scream.
Right? And this was sort of winking too, because it was the slasher movie with the invisible slasher, right? Who we're not even sure if there's really a willpower there or not, or are they really just dying from bad luck and they're imagining the shadow they see skittering around? I don't know. Actually, the movie might be more interesting if it even asked that question. It doesn't. Death's just hunting them.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why it was successful. Is people needed to see blood again for the first time in a decade on the big screen. People were just ready to see some bodies get ripped apart.
If you want to see Stifler gets his head split in half, that'll give you that opportunity.
Which I enjoyed, right? I was licking my chops waiting for Stifler to die the whole time we were watching this movie.
One more thing, and again, I don't want to make too such of a much out of Final Destination, but there is a pretty amusing one-scene role from the aforementioned Tony Todd.
Yes. We're tying things back together.
He lays it on so fucking thick, but it is kind of delicious.
And that performance is part of why it was just a couple days later that I watched Cube and thought, man, I wish a young Tony Todd had been playing this character in Cube. I'll repeat my caveat for the third time. None of these are terrible movies.
Decent list.
I don't want anyone to think that I'm beating up on Alex Proyas again, like I did with iRobot.
All right.
But I have to put Knowing at number 6 on this list. So probably right out of the gate, I'm losing again on my fourth visit to Rank and Review. I lose. I mentioned earlier. Spoilers. Number 5 is Final Destination. And
right.
The reason it beats Knowing is because it passes the did it accomplish what it set out to do?
Yeah.
And Final Destination did, and Knowing did not.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely certain what Knowing was setting out to do. I would have liked to see that movie though.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it was quite this one. And you said a similar thing, right? That the movie was it was this shy
it's one of those
being something really
movies.
special.
Yeah.
And but it fell far short of very special for me. So I put it at number 6. I certainly liked it much more than I liked iRobot, but it wasn't half the movie Dark City was.
Right.
That being said, if somebody asked me which of these movies should I watch, I might say watch Knowing. There's more interesting thought processes going on in Knowing. It just doesn't succeed filmatically, if that's even a word. But Final Destination is empty calories for sure. Knowing had some meat to it, but it was gamey.
Fair enough.
It was no good anymore. Number 4 goes to Cube. Why is Cube so low on the list? Cube is so low on the list because of those
other
way
movies.
all over the place performances.
Yeah.
Is what it is. I have a lot of love for Cube. It's not a diss that Cube's on the bottom half of this list.
Yeah.
Cube's one of the coolest, most imaginative Canadian movies you can find out there, and it's pretty astonishing that a movie shot in 2 tiny little rooms can convince us that it's taking place in this enormous, cavernous, 500-foot wide space full of 10,000 rooms.
Seriously, a beer for everyone involved.
Yeah,
by all means.
A whole round of beers, even for the main guy who really he needs 12 beers. He needs to chill the fuck out and stop beating people.
He was really at 11 the whole time.
He started at 11 and turned it up to 13 for the scene where he assaults the girl. I'm giving the Cooler number 3.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm giving the Cooler number 3. I like the Cooler. I like the Cooler. Feels like a movie. I'm surprised I didn't see it at the time. It feels like a movie that came right out of a period of time when. Well, we watched The Big Lebowski for your 40th birthday.
Yep.
Just this, 24 hours ago from now, we were finishing it up in this very room. And, sometimes there's a movie that just fits right in to its time and place. The Cooler it just belongs right there in 2003. It feels like it was plucked right out of that time period. And not in a bad way. Not in a, ooh, that's dated, that's an early 2000s movie.
Yeah.
I don't know really what all to say about The Cooler. as far as it might have beaten Live, Die, Repeat if I hadn't been so delightfully surprised by Live, Die, Repeat.
Right.
When I watched The Cooler, I got pretty much what I expected, which was good. It was a quality movie.
Yeah.
I would, if on the Ebert scale, it would get 3 stars, I'd say, on the Ebert 4-star scale. He did 4 stars, right, in his tribute reviews. But Live, Die, Repeat, I went in. I came out of Live, Die, Repeat having been given much more than I walked in expecting.
Right.
And so I guess that influences my ranking. Maybe it shouldn't. Maybe The Cooler's a better movie. This is one of the 2 places where I struggled. I struggled with the bottom of the list. Where do I put Knowing and Final Destination? I struggled with Cooler and Live, Die, Repeat. Or Edge of Tomorrow, whatever we're calling it. Live, Die, Repeat, number 2. Watch it. I think it's, other than Groundhog Day, my number 1 pick, Live, Die, Repeat, will please the broadest audience.
Spectrum, for sure.
Because it'll please you whether you want a bunch of explosions. It will please you if you want to actually turn your brain on and pay attention to the movie on a level deeper than that.
Right.
The only way the movie can really not entertain you, I guess, is if you just really can't stand Tom Cruise.
Right.
Which I suppose, if I'm in the wrong mood, I'm going to dislike a Tom Cruise movie just for him. But the day we watched Live, Die, Repeat, I was Tom Cruise friendly, apparently. He didn't bother me. Groundhog Day stands proudly atop this list. It's easily the number 1 movie on this list. I feel like, if on nothing else, you and I will agree on that. I hereby predict that Groundhog Day will be Larry's resounding number 1 as well.
Right.
Everyone should see this movie.
And most people have, to be honest.
But everyone should see this movie, and then everyone should see this movie a second time. This movie should be seen a couple of times.
It is that incredibly rare, deep rom-com.
Mm-hmm. Groundhog Day is the only movie on this list that I would be seriously taken aback if someone told me they really hated Groundhog Day. Any other movie on this list, I'd be able to chalk it up to wrong mood. But how do you hate Groundhog Day? It's perfect.
I think it's probably fair to call it a classic at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a fair thing to say.
Yep.
And I don't think there are any other classics on this list. So yes, we definitely agree.
I agree there are no other classics. It's the only one.
Yeah. Okay, well, before I tell you why you're wrong, we started this whole epic podcast that we're going to decide whether or not we have free will or whether or not everything is
I still
predetermined.
have to answer that question.
And after watching these movies and chewing this over, have you come to a conclusion? Has cinema answered the great question?
Could I answer this question by telling you that I choose not to answer it? Would that be proof of my free will?
I don't think it would. I don't think it would be.
Short version is no. I don't think we have free will, and that is coming from somebody who also does not believe in predestination and fate.
Yeah.
I am not a capital A atheist, but I'm close.
For me, it's just like another subgenre of the horror movies. Like, I like monsters and I like ghosts, and I don't need to believe in them to be entertained by these movies.
Right. I mean, I can quite enjoy sitting down and watching. I was going to say The Passion of the Christ, but I mean The Last Temptation of Christ, without believing in Jeebus.
Yeah. Like, I can watch The Descent without believing in underground monsters.
Yeah, I can Fear the Walking Dead or The Walking Dead, fantastic, without believing in zombies.
It doesn't make it more frightening because it's quote-unquote true.
And I can enjoy Groundhog Day without believing in Punxsutawney Phil.
But consequently, it's not your fault that we disagree. You had no choice but to make the decisions that you made.
Yeah.
And if not for Groundhog's Day, dude, we would have gone 0 for 6.
Really? We're all mixed up.
Look, I put Final Destination at the bottom of the list. It's not terrible. It's not at all memorable. There's just nothing amazing or exceptional.
And I can't argue with you because I almost put it there myself.
But I think the one that's going to piss you off
is Knowing, which is number 2.
No, it's not second place. But I put Cube all the way down in 5th place.
That doesn't piss me off at all. I put it in number 4.
Yeah, but like, it's much like Knowing, which I'm about to talk about. It's a sci-fi movie that's got some loud and obvious flaws. Mm-hmm. But I love it for what it wants to be. You know, I love the ambition of the movie. I might even love it more than it's worth. But I do love Cube. But I'm not going to argue that it's a better movie than these others on the list. Squeaking in at number 4 is where I put Knowing.
Where you put Knowing.
And Again, I love what it wants to be. I love the ambition of it. I love isolated scenes in the movie. Genuinely surprising moments in the movie. When Rose Byrne gets smoked by that rig, we didn't even mention her, I don't think, in the review, but she's just like Nicolas Cage, another mom trying to find a way to save her daughter in an impossible situation. And her payoff is to get fucking creamed by a truck.
Yeah,
and I did not see that coming the first time I watched the movie. I didn't know where that story was going, but I certainly did not expect it to dead end in the way it did. So, it surprised me. And, if someone had fucking thrown some coffee in Nick Cage, and made him care, I think we might have had something a little more special. So I might be giving it more credit than it's worth, but
in my defense, everyone on screen, and I felt like everyone behind the camera in Cube felt like they really wanted to be there and cared about the project. So Cube has to at least beat it on that one note at the very least.
It might have more heart, but I'm going to argue that knowing might be slightly more interesting.
Yeah, heart isn't everything.
It's tough, though. I mean, like, the middle of this list is hard to get super passionate about.
Yep.
In third place is Live, Die, Repeat. I guess the rest of the list is really self-explanatory.
Yep.
But yeah, it over-exceeded my expectations, and based on one viewing, and again, maybe if I watched it again, I would see more or less. But based on that one viewing, absolutely worth checking out. And I haven't said that about a lot of Tom Cruise shoot-'em-ups.
Nope, I still can't believe I did say it.
Yeah, so way to go, Doug Liman. High-concept sci-fi thriller that works, and we need more of those.
Spent a lot of money, and it actually sort of worked anyway.
The Cooler is kind of an original number.
Yep.
Like, as much as I have a problem with that last fucking scene, and again, if I had any kind of editorial notes, I'm just like, seriously, guys, take out the last scene and put the sex back in the movie, and I will be selling this to everybody I fucking know, right?
Yep.
But because there's no movie like it, because it highlights William H. Macy, who's typically a B player, it's nice to see him center a movie and do well at it, you know? You know, he had Jerry Lundegaard and then basically supporting actor most of the time.
Until
right?
Shameless, yeah.
Yeah, so...
I also enjoyed watching Bill Macy play a pathetic loser who doesn't lose.
Yeah.
Right? He wins in the end,
He wins huge.
Which I really didn't see coming through most of the movie. I just didn't see it coming. Even after he wins, you don't see it coming.
The stakes are heavy. Like, you believe he could take a bullet till the credits run. Like, it could go either way, it feels like.
And the filmmakers were clearly trying to play with that by giving us that tacked on scene at the end, which our lists would probably match on that top half if it weren't for that final scene in the cooler.
Yeah.
That final scene makes the difference for me with Live, Die, Repeat. There's no scene at the end of Live, Die, Repeat that makes me go, what the hell is that doing in the movie?
For me, it's just like, I can say that Live, Die, Repeat is sci-fi Groundhog's Day, right? But I can't say that the cooler is a faint photocopy of any. Nothing else immediately jumps to my mind. The cooler is
although
the cooler.
we came pretty close with a Twilight Zone Inside Hard 8.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. But still, what the hell does that mean? It's pretty amorphous, and it does, maybe more than any other movie,
and it's an idea,
stand out.
It's a concept of a movie, not an actual movie, right?
Yeah.
So I appreciate what it's trying, and it is a very supernatural movie, but it doesn't feel. It feels very real.
Mm-hmm.
However, Groundhog's Day is operating on a whole fucking other level. This was a list with Groundhog's Day and 5 other movies.
Yep.
Like, it's not any of their faults.
It made the list one notch easier than it usually is, because there was the other movies are in a different class.
And look, I know we agreed on almost nothing, but we're still, it's margins.
The lists are all,
degrees.
nowhere is there a gap of more than one movie. Everything's just off by one notch.
And honestly, even looking at the list, like when I was like, am I really putting Cube in 5th? But, because I do genuinely love the movie. Like, the only one that I could say you don't necessarily need to make time for is Final Destination. And even that, it's not bad. It's just, it's unexceptional. But I think if you like genre movies, these are good ones.
If you're into movies enough to listen to this podcast all the way to the end and hear the rankings, then you should see all of these movies. And if there's one you want to scratch off the list first, it should probably be Final Destination.
Is it all set in stone? Is all of our choice just an illusion? Is there a path set before us, or can we choose our destiny? And are those a lot of big cans of big worms to open up on a podcast? Yes, well, maybe, but I hope you enjoyed it anyway. Thank you for listening to episode 82 of Rank and Review. Please, if you'd like to send me feedback, you can do that by sending me messages at ranknreview@gmail.com. That's ranknreview@gmail.com. Find the podcast on Facebook, find it on Stitcher. And do me a favor and tell that other movie nerd in your life that there's this podcast called Rank and Review, and it doesn't suck. I'll talk to you again soon.